This is Disaster and After, how we face the worst and build what's next.
Out of his uniform pocket, he pulled out a handgun, put it on his lap, and he said, "Sir, is there anybody you'd like me to kill for you?" And I said, "Yes, I got a couple of people." And I laughed for the first time in weeks.
Disaster confronts us with the sudden, the violent, the unpredictable. It reveals the limits of our systems and our own fragility. After the storm comes a choice. This is part one of a conversation with retired Admiral Brian Flynn, a pioneer in the world of disaster mental health. We're going to look back at three defining moments in modern disaster response: Hurricane Andrew, the Oklahoma City bombing, and the Columbine school shooting. Thank you very much, Brian, for doing this. And as a retired admiral, you and I know each other, so I hope it's okay if I call you Brian.
You certainly can.
Great.
Glad to be here.
I'm just going to hand over to you, Brian. You've worked in some of the hardest chapters in our history, and why do you think it's important to explore these stories now?
Well, I think we all need to learn from history. And there has been a rapidly expanding history in disaster behavioral health, certainly since I've been in the field. And there's been so much that has changed in the several decades that I've been involved that I felt it was important to capture that for future generations, because I'm at the end of my career at this point, and I want to make sure that my experiences and what I've learned and failed to learn really inform future generations of folks that are in this field.
Wonderful. So we're going to talk about the experiences that shape your life, not as case studies, but as lived moments, the real experiences that reveal kind of our resilience, leadership, and what things really look like under pressure. So we'll start at the beginning. How did you find yourself working in disaster behavioral health, and what pulled you toward that?
Well, I started life as a baby. I'm a believer that we're the sum of all of our biology, our experiences, our influences. But I think for me, to make a long story short, I grew up in a family where my father was a social worker. And so I came up with that value system. I also, I'll show my age now, I was in high school when JFK was president. And I remember vividly his inaugural statement about ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And that struck me at that time. And I think those are two major influences in telling me that I needed to spend my career in something that was in public service and that was in the behavioral health arena. So I wound up getting my master's degree initially in clinical psychology, but finding that really wasn't what my passion was. And I became very interested in community mental health and policy and systems, and ended up getting my doctorate in mental health administration. But early in my career, I joined the U.S. Public Health Service and wound up in their regional office system, working with primarily community development and monitoring of grants to community mental health centers. So when I was in Boston, I was there for the blizzard of '78. And it was one of the early FEMA-funded crisis counseling services grants that came up. And so I wound up being part of that. And during the Reagan administration, they closed all the regional offices. I was brought to Washington basically to work on an immigration emergency, the Mariel boat lift at that point, and which was another kind of disaster that I hadn't been exposed to, and did that for several years, and then went to work in the disaster mental health program, then the National Institute of Mental Health, and wound up working in it, heading that.
So when did you realize that this wasn't just like a short-term assignment, but that disaster work would define your career? Was there any particular moment, or was it just sort of a gradual realization?
I think it was the progression of things. Again, it was it's a topic for another program, But community mental health changed in this country over the years, and this was the remnants of that. The FEMA-funded crisis counseling program really was about treating communities and treating people in their communities and looking at more than just mental illness and mental disorders. For me, one of the things that captured me was particularly when I started doing disaster response work, was that I really hadn't been trained well for that. I had been pretty well trained, I think, in diagnosing, treating mental disorders, but that's not the story of disaster mental health.
Right.
That the primary story for that is resilience and recovery and support and education, and that was something that I don't think we do well with in the behavioral health field. We don't balance that. We're so oriented toward disorders that this gave me an opportunity to really focus on the balance of that. And I've done that throughout my career. Everything I do, when I look at problems, as I look at the problems, but I look at what are the solutions, what are the strengths that people and communities bring. Mm-hmm. So I think that really helped keep my interest, and I just had so many wonderful opportunities that not many people got. Some people have said to me, how could you do that kind of work, go to these disasters? Yeah. And to me, it's really, how could I not do that work, given the opportunity? It's such an opportunity, and I feel so fortunate to have the opportunity to do that. I couldn't pass it up until I got too old to do it again.
I would second, it's a rare chance to kind of have an impact. So you've said Hurricane Andrew, and you and I talked before this a little, so you told me that Hurricane Andrew had, of all the disasters you worked on, and again, you've worked on dozens and dozens or hundreds, I don't know the number, but that Hurricane Andrew had the greatest personal impact on you. So could you say a little bit about what Hurricane Andrew was, and then, what made that experience different for you?
I often say that people have asked, what was the worst disaster for you? And for me, that was Hurricane Andrew. I differentiate that between the most powerful one for me, which is Oklahoma City, which we'll talk about. But that was powerful because there were so many positives with it.
Right.
I've told people, that if you do this work long enough, there's going to be at least one that gets to you psychologically. Yeah. It's going to contain a constellation of experiences and reactions that are tougher on you for a variety of reasons. First of all, it was a huge disaster. And it occurred in 1992. It was a Category 5 hurricane, and it did over $27 billion worth of property damage. It was like nothing I had ever seen. I went up in a helicopter shortly after getting down there, and I'd never seen anything like it. As far as you could see, there was destruction, trees down, houses down, railroad cars tipped over on their tracks. It was huge. Yeah. But it really was not, for me, the size and magnitude of the event itself. It was some of the administrative problems that came along with it that created the extraordinary stress for me.
Yeah, it makes sense. I certainly can vouch for the fact that sometimes it's not the scale of the disaster or the just how horrific it is. It can be sometimes just what's happening behind the scenes, especially if that's what you're working on.
The thing that made it bad was the management of it, frankly. Yeah. You talk about the importance of leadership. Right. Well, there was a challenge in every piece of leadership in there. Right. I think my FEMA colleagues, who I love and respect dearly, would acknowledge that was not a particularly well-managed disaster from the FEMA perspective. The Public Health Service had never really mounted a major health response before. So this was their first. That didn't work well at the start. They do much better now than they did then. And then, as you know, from your experiences, one of the people I worked with primarily was the Commissioner of Mental Health for Florida. He'd been on the job 2 weeks when that happened. So,
and again, probably not trained.
No, he didn't expect any of this. He's a wonderful guy, but completely caught off guard. Yeah. And frankly, all three of these groups felt that they owned me, that had me as their primary resource for behavioral health issues, which was fine, except there wasn't enough for me to go around.
Yeah.
We didn't have people, didn't have a whole staff.
They'd send out the one guy,
stamps
and you were
for
supposed
that.
to make it all.
I was the guy.
Yeah.
And I just couldn't keep up. And there were competing demands that were made. There were inappropriate demands that were made. And that was what got to me, was more the administrative kinds of issues and stressors than the work itself. The work itself was rewarding, but I couldn't do it because of trying to balance all of these political and other administrative issues.
You've said sometimes that disasters are political events. What did you mean? What do you mean by that?
Well, both with small p and big P. In some disasters, there's politics in everything, whether it's from the city council to the governor to the president, there's always political involvement. And often that's extremely helpful in getting things done. But when there's political conflict or failed political leadership, then there becomes problems. I often said, for many years, one of the lessons for me from Hurricane Andrew is never have a catastrophic disaster in a presidential election year. Yeah. That was a huge problem because everybody running for president there, came through the disaster field office, criticized what everybody was doing there and talked about how it shouldn't be done this way, and if they were in charge, it'd be done differently and done better. Well, that was very demoralizing to people. There was interference all the time. There were just many failures of leadership with both the big P and small p for politics.
Yeah, that totally makes sense to me. I know. I know those experiences well, especially if you're in the career service and or in your case, you were in the public health service. And so you kind of have to just absorb it. So you've spoken openly about getting counseling afterward.
As a behavioral health professional, I don't think I should be in a position of telling people that they ought to get treatment what they needed if I wasn't willing to do it myself. Mm-hmm. Maybe many things, but I don't think I'm much of a hypocrite. So I think it's practicing what you preach, first of all. Secondly, my stress was showing up in ways that was very visible to me and compromising my ability to function. I know my vulnerabilities, and I know that, if I'm stressed, I don't sleep well. Right. I don't eat properly. I developed GI problems, and all of those things were happening. Just wasn't able to concentrate, wasn't able to complete tasks, wasn't able to prioritize things, and I knew it was happening to me. If I can tell you a quick little story here about stress intervention. One of the things that was a problem for me was I just didn't have enough time to do the job. And one of the things that needed to be done was there needed to be some counselors, some stress management resources brought into the FEMA disaster field office there. And they were looking for me to do that. Yeah, people were having fist fights there. They were, it was terrible. I couldn't do it because I was too busy with all these other.
You had another,
and these were people I cared about, people that counted on me to do this kind of stuff. So I needed a day that I could basically write a contract to bring some of these resources in. It was just didn't have the time to do that. I was telling this to a psychiatrist resource down there, a colleague who was in charge of the Army mental health resources down there. And he said, look, I got a team coming in tomorrow. I can let you have them up there for a couple of days, but then I need them down here. And I said, that's great. Have them show up at my office there. They did. This team showed up. I told them about the stress in the building, and I said, go take a look, and walk around, then come back, and we'll talk about some priorities. They never came back. And my psychiatrist colleague called me, and he said, I'm really sorry, Brian. He said, they're down here in Cutler Ridge, down in the disaster area. He said, they'd never seen anything like that and didn't want anything to do with it. So he said, I'm really sorry. He said, I got a young psychiatrist coming in by himself tomorrow. Same thing. I can let you have him for a few days, and then I need him down here. I said, fine. So he showed up in uniform with his pack on and everything, and I oriented him, sent him off, and he did come back. And he said, "This is amazing." He said, "This is a hotbed of psychopathology here. That needs some help here."
Yeah.
And I realized how stressed I was when I just let loose with him. I said, "Yeah, did you think I was lying? I've been telling everybody here, that these people need help. Bad things are happening here, and nobody seems to listen. I don't have the time and all this." And he just listened to me. And I outranked him significantly. And he said, "Sir, you're not doing well, are you?" And I said, "No, I'm not. You think I was lying? I can't sleep. I can't do this." And out of his uniform pocket, he pulled out a handgun, put it on his lap, and he said, "Sir, is there anybody you'd like me to kill for you?" And I said, "Yes, I got a couple of people." And I laughed for the first time in weeks. And you and I have talked about the importance of humor here. He gave me an opportunity to laugh. We were in a room by ourselves, so nobody could overhear it. I'm sure he doesn't behave or talk that way in his practice now, but it was the culturally right thing to do. He relieved my stress with it. We laughed, and I told him my biggest problem was I can't sleep. And he pulled out of his pack some sleep medication, which is usually that's usually the prescription of choice for stress and disasters for workers, not antidepressants or those kinds of things. And I was able to sleep after that. It didn't solve the problems, but it helped me get through the next coming days. So just a funny little anecdote. But when I finally left, I used to have to go down there every 2 weeks for 2 weeks. We was alternating with another one of our staff members. And when I was finally finished down there, I was still in bad shape. And so I contacted a therapist who had been part of a disaster mental health team that was down there. She was the head of social services for the Crowley Shock Trauma Center in Baltimore. So she knows stress. She knew this disaster. I knew her and trusted her. And I said, "When I leave the plane, could I come to your office? I want to come talk to you before I go home, because I'm shaky. I'm really feeling very fragile." It was the best way I could explain it. And so I went and met with her, and I was a mess. And I kept telling her all of the things that I couldn't do, or that I couldn't do the way I wanted to, or expectations I couldn't live up to. And she kept asking me, "What could you have done?" And I said, "Well, there's nothing I could have done, but this, that," and we went through this. She said, "Brian, do you see a pattern here? There are not other things you could have done here." And so I talked with her several times after that. I also that day said, "Would you be good enough to call my wife before I get home and tell her what kind of shape I'm in, that I'm crying easily, my priorities seem messed up, I may concentrate on things, I may want to talk, I may want to be quiet, I'm unpredictable at this point. Kind of warn her about this and prepare her." And she said, "I'd be glad to." She did that. And so I came. My wife has always been supportive, but this helped her know how to be supportive to me. And that was an important part, I think, of if I couldn't do that, I don't have any right to tell other people that they ought to do it.
Yeah, no. Well, that's all. Yeah, I think all of that resonates with me. I'll tell you, after September 11th, I think I had 5 days where I didn't sleep at all. And at some point, that changes you, physically. You can't sustain that. So I understand that. What I was going to say is, I think this sounds like from this that it wasn't just about kind of your own personal need, or you kind of gain some awareness that the collapse of the system or the systemic failure was really, part of what was causing all of this crisis, and how people kind of related to each other. So I think that's going to shape up for some of our next conversation, because in our next discussion, we're going to talk about really facing the worst, and but also some of the better things that can happen in a disaster response. You're going to talk about the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, And that's a disaster that in many ways changed the way we Americans perceive ourselves. So thank you for this chapter.